Hey, everybody. So, two live streams in one day. Who's excited about that? All right. Nobody can say that I am not running a breaking newsroom here in the middle of nowhere with my 1-year-old producer. So, here's the thing. Before I bring Dr. Cotenzero in, he's in the green room right now. I want to tell you guys why, briefly, I'm doing this. Okay. And briefly, what precipitated this particular story. So we're going to talk about it in detail with Dr. Cotenzero. But when I was a TV news reporter, this all happened back in 2014, before I was assigned to cover the environment. I was told pretty late in the evening that they were going to move me to the story about the Department of Health saying they were suspending a naturopathic physician near our station, north of Seattle. And they sent out a press release. That's how we found out about it. And I think, if I remember correctly, other stuff during the day had fallen through. I was a nightside reporter at that point in time, and other stuff had fallen through. And hungry for filling the newscast, my producer said, just do this. Okay, just do this. The Department of Health, said this guy's experimenting on his patients, and we just ran with it. It was too late to get a statement from the doctor himself, who you're going to meet. He's been magnanimous enough to give me another chance and to talk to you guys about what happened, and was to give an interview later after we basically smeared his reputation. The reason that I want to tell you all about this is for a couple reasons. The first is because I try to tell my audience on this channel about sort of the mundane human trappings of how fake news gets out there. And a lot of people think that it's, these really aware, people with tons of time to conspire to brainwash their communities. And in some cases, it's people who are just assigned something that they really just can't do good journalism about. The time constraints, the deadlines, having to keep it to 90 seconds. And then, just all of that adds up to also people who are just like trusting bureaucratic sources because they're not sitting back and critically thinking about stuff coming out and how the government has its own agenda and how all of these pieces work, because the system is in a lot of ways set up to keep people from thinking through the dynamics of how the world works. And when you start realizing how the world works, oftentimes you end up quitting because you realize that your work is not in this infrastructure going to reflect those complexities, because you simply can't. You're probably not going to know what you're talking about in the depth that you need to know it by the end of the day. And you're certainly not going to be able to present it, because who could present a complex topic in 90 seconds or less? And that typically is the standard. So, I'm going to bring our guest in. I just want to give a quick primer, though, for people who might be new. Remember that I do clip live streams after the fact. So YouTube gets a certain portion of it, but the full stream is going to be on my other platforms. And so that includes ROKFIN, where I should be streaming right now. I should be co-streaming on ROKFIN. I started that one a little bit late, but it should be working. And Odyssey, it'll be on Odyssey. I'll have the full stream up on Locals. Just a quick plug for my Locals account. You have the opportunity to message me on Locals, post ideas on Locals. So it's AllisonMorrow.locals.com. I encourage you to go over there also, because I do take a lot of story ideas from my Locals community, and it's just a great way to talk with each other. So again, just, order of business, make sure that if you're watching this intro right now, but it's after the fact of the live stream, you're probably not going to see the entirety. Some of it will be uploaded as a separate clip, but the entire live stream will be on my other platforms. Also, my Patreon subscribers will get the link to that as well. So without further ado, we have Dr. John Cotenzero. And I really appreciate, though you are, did I accidentally mute you? Maybe I did. No, you need to unmute your mic. There you go. Okay. I really appreciate both the fact that back in the day in 2014, you were willing to do an interview after that that fateful night where myself and I think some other outlets just kind of ran with what the Department of Health was telling us about the circumstances. I'm going to tell people a little bit about what it was like interviewing your patients after the fact. And then we're going to talk about the world as it is right now with speech suppression related to health, your thoughts on COVID, on the COVID vaccines, on therapeutics and all that stuff, because, this is something that you know a lot about as well. So I guess let's start with that event itself. I kind of explained what I knew of it at the time, but why don't you tell us what's happening behind the scenes?
Well, that event actually took me by surprise. It was blindsided. Pretty much the Department of Health came in on a Wednesday evening. We call it a Black Wednesday, and pretty much they basically said that they were going to. They pretty much ordered me for cease and desist with the current treatments that I was doing for patients. My specialty basically was in cancer treatment, so I got to see cancer patients that were resistant in their diagnosis. In other words, they actually had maybe a few months to live, and they had failed other forms of treatment. So that's primarily the reason why they go to a naturopathic physician, right, is to pretty much see if there's any other alternatives. And of course, I was doing an advanced therapy that involved separating out, their proteins and being able to develop what they call a peptide type immunotherapy strategy. And that's what I was doing at the center. And of course, I had, 6 other physicians at the center that were practicing along with me. And we were very progressive in our treatment. So they came in, pretty much said that there was threats that if I didn't shut the doors, I didn't get the patients out, I didn't do a cease and desist, that they were, they had the right to arrest me and so on and so forth. When my attorneys had already been, summoned, and they were already, in action, so to speak. But, pretty much the state jumped the gun. And of course, they had no basis to do that.
I'm going to show everybody what our initial story was, so they kind of get an idea. I'm guessing the square here may have been my video. I'm not really quite sure. I'm actually surprised this even still exists, because I know that they've switched to different web servers. And so a lot of my old stories don't even exist anymore, but I found this one. So we titled it, Bothell Naturopathic Doctor Suspended for Experimental Vaccine. And it says you're facing charges of misleading cancer patients. And I'm going to scroll down to, in documents filed by the Washington Department of Health, Dr. Cotenzero is accused of treating cancer patients with an experimental vaccine, but never telling them the treatment was an experiment or that he lacked necessary approval from the FDA. According to the documents, there's no proof the treatment is even effective. And then they go on to quote Dr. Jane Gillitan, I don't know if I'm saying her name right, from, she's a dean of the School of Naturopathic Medicine at Bastyr, which is where you were a graduate. Is that correct?
That's right. Yep. Okay.
So I should add to everybody that nowhere in this initial article did we get a quote from you at all. I don't see anything in here. I know that I wasn't able to get a hold of you because your office was closed. And I don't know if my office reached out or not, but I just know they went ahead and published this story, probably in part because they just wanted to get it up because everybody else was doing it, because there was a press release that was sent out by the government. And also because I just think some people, we don't realize that we may move on to some other story the next day, but we leave you with the dumpster fire that we hand to you, right? So like we just crash somebody's career, and we're like, oh, well, whatever, we'll get a statement another time. Or oftentimes we'll hear that at the end, like, we haven't heard back yet. And we don't think to ourselves, well, maybe we should wait to run the story for when we hear back, or maybe it's not fair to call an office at 5:30 at night and expect that anyone's going to get back to us in the next hour. So we should just wait to run this, even if our competitors are still doing so. A lot of that stuff was just not something that we were considering, but I want to give you a chance to respond to that stuff, because that's just what we put out there in that first initial report.
Right. So just to kind of bring clarity to it, every patient that came into our clinic was seen with extensive interviewing, and they signed informed consents, and we had gone over the treatments. I had gone over the treatments personally, directly, risks, benefits, the whole bit, notated in their charts as you would do in any medical practice, because the medical chart's a legal document basically, and all of those prescribed measures were followed, and they were also notified that the treatment was an experimental treatment, not approved by the FDA. We actually had in process what we call individual patient, what they call emergency approval on patients. So we had that in process. And so whenever they made the statements that it wasn't, the FDA, it was against the FDA, it was against, this agency, it was against the state scope of practice, everything was false, because all of the things that were in the treatment were basically in the scope of practice of a naturopathic physician. Patients signed informed consent. They were informed about experimental treatment. They elected to do this treatment themselves. So there was nothing shady. There was nothing outside of what you would see in a normal practice environment. And so when this actually came out, after the fact, they summoned charts after the fact. They did not do their due diligence beforehand, so they actually jumped the gun. And
are you saying that's because they got a complaint of some kind and they just ran with it? Because I do remember hearing that they said they had patient A and patient B said that they didn't know that it was not FDA approved or it wasn't experimental.
Well, actually, where it derived from was one of the bigger cancer institutes in Seattle, because I actually had several patients that were going to the breast center there in Seattle, and it's a pretty large cancer institute, and these patients were getting better. And so because of the fact that many of the patients that I was getting were also being treated at this cancer center, it came to the chief of the cancer center's attention, and she's the one that actually placed the complaint with the state of Washington. So it wasn't a patient-derived complaint. It was actually a cancer institution complaint. And then the state followed up with that, and they took their action immediately. And then what winds up happening, there was a whole bunch of cascade stuff that went on, including closed door meetings and threats and things of that nature. I mean, it's like unbelievable. You would never think that something like this would actually happen to you, but it happened.
Tell me about the software too, because I remember that being an issue that I read about. They said something like you told them that your software was behind, or wasn't keeping record of something. Can you explain that claim of theirs as well?
Basically, that claim was that I didn't have the current research-based software, in my system. So I actually had, your typical EMR plus a, database that actually kept track of all the patients, but it was not like a software that you would see at Fred Hutch Cancer or some of these other institutions, right? So the thing is that the basic difference between what I was doing was I was focusing in on treatment of the patient as a physician. So as a physician, I had the right to offer my patients safe and effective treatments that were actually going to be helpful for their individual diagnoses, right? So I wasn't really a research institute doing research. I was actually administering treatment to the patients. So I didn't have the latest research software, but we did have our EMR software. We did have our internal tracking software that would actually look at the patient's history and keep track of all their clinical progress. So all of that was in place. But they were just trying to find something that they could say that I was, practicing outside, coloring outside the lines. I was not authorized to do so. But the bottom line is that after all of the information was out, it was then concluded that I was not outside of my practice guidelines, and in fact, I was offering patients an elective treatment that would be safe and effective for them to choose.
I'm going to play the video that we did as a follow-up. I think it was a year later when you were readying for your return to work. But in the meantime, before we did that, not long after that initial story, I believe I heard from your son initially and then linked up with you and was given names of your patients. In fact, I believe I sat down with at least a half dozen of them and I interviewed them. And I think, gosh, I had this pit in the base of my stomach because here I was talking to these people who had survived cancers that, well, one cancer that had killed my grandfather in 6 months. I'll never forget one of your patients saying to me that she had, I hope I say this right, I always get it wrong, multiple myeloma. Am I saying that right?
Multiple myeloma, that's right, yes.
Okay. And that's an extremely aggressive form of cancer. And I remember her asking, because I said, my grandfather had that. And she said, how is your grandfather? And I said, he died within 6 months. And she had been alive years. I don't even know if she still had cancer anymore. I don't remember, but she looked great. Yep. Another guy that had stage 4 melanoma, no more cancer, doing great, alive, fine. And I'm sitting here and they told me their treatments were disposed of, that it was forcibly disposed of because of this event that I had participated in, perpetuating essentially. And here I am looking at these patients who have survived these cancers that they attribute to you. You know, they attribute their survival to these treatments that you're getting that the government threw out. And here I am like, what have I done? Do you remember having to toss out these treatments?
Yes, that was probably one of the darkest days of my career, and basically we were ordered to discard in the medical waste viable treatments. We had 25 viable treatments that were in process, in development, and they were just about ready to be given to the patients. And we were told that I would be criminally prosecuted if I didn't dispose of those treatments. So I was advised by my attorneys to dispose of the treatments, and I had to. It was a terrible experience. The patients, suffered greatly. There was just no way to come back from that type of disaster. It was terrible. It was a terrible experience.
It was gut-wrenching, and I think that experience really changed the way I looked at these press releases, these events where it's like the authority that I was taught to respect and trust. Even if I sat back and said like, okay, at best, I just don't know the full story. But here I am sitting, listening to these people who are like devastated about this situation, and it's their actual lives are on the line. And the information that we were peddling based on what the Department of Health was just telling us, and we were just trusting them, like they are here to serve the public. They're here to take care of us. They're here to block us from charlatans. Here I am, like, and I don't even think I was necessarily down. I was like as naive as I'm making it sound, because I think at that point I was already starting to wake up a little bit. I mean, at least I was receptive to what was happening in front of me. But even then, I still probably did have a portion in my mind that was just thinking like, they're here to help. They're here to keep us from quacks practicing snake oil medicine on people. And then here I have this group of patients who are like, we feel like this saved our lives and we're scared we're going to die now. And I'm like, well, how is the Department of Health protecting these people exactly? Like, what am I missing here? You know what I mean? Because should they be able to choose what they want? Like if you're doing something and they feel like they're alive today and, you're a practicing physician. And I think maybe one thing would be helpful for people too, is for you to explain what kind of training you have and what your background is. Cause I think sometimes people hear naturopathic doctor and they're thinking that you're just rubbing like, red clay dust or something with the eye of a newt and then putting it all together,
You're right. Yes.
So, cause you have your own company now where you're working on some pretty incredible stuff, and we'll get into that in a second too. But you know what, let me just play this. I'm going to play a piece of our updated story from when we interviewed you after that, when you were getting ready to reopen your practice, and just let people kind of see how that all went down.
Story that's new at 7 o'clock.
Bags of personalized IV supplements are filled every day at this Bothell clinic, many for patients with fatal diagnoses like Tammy Wilson.
January 15th, 2013.
It was the day Wilson learned she had stage 4 breast cancer and that she'd likely only live another 2 years.
Kept thinking, this has to be a mistake.
The 54-year-old decided to pair her oncology treatment with a protein therapy or cancer vaccine offered by Dr. John Cotenzero.
The patients were in a crucial space with their diagnosis.
The state suspended Dr. Cotenzero for that very vaccine in late January, citing unreasonable risk and his use unethical.
The strain on my patients has been pretty intense.
Wilson,
I said, what's going on?
was receiving treatment the day state officials informed Cotenzero of his suspension. Could you hear that okay?
Yep, I can hear it just fine.
Okay, all right.
I remember the day.
Okay. She'd no longer have the option to choose it.
It's ridiculous because this is my body.
Since then, she's only been able to receive these IV supplements, but not the vaccine, even though Dr. Cotenzero says he was not experimenting, but offering personalized treatment based on the patient's unique genetics.
The problem is that how do you regulate that?
And that, he believes, makes him and other naturopaths more vulnerable for discipline. After settling with the state, he owes a $5,000 fine, but can reapply for his license in February.
And I believe that this has been an obstacle, but I've learned a lot through it.
His next goal, equalizing his field of alternative cancer treatments with conventional medicine.
I'm not going to quit doing what I'm doing. I'm just going to get better at it.
And okay, I'm hearing from some people the video is really low, so I'm going to stop it. But basically, if you couldn't hear very well, that's one of your patients, and she's saying she couldn't get her treatment anymore, but she is able to get some kind. She wasn't able to get the protein therapy you're talking about. She was able to get some IV supplements, but not what she was originally seeing you for, because that had to be disposed of per the Department of Health's position on all of this. So I guess any thoughts specifically on, I know we already sort of talked about those patients and everything, on now looking back on it, was there anything the Department of Health said that you feel like, okay, there was some truth to that, or I could have done that better? Or do you feel like it was just, a completely falsified attack?
Well, you always learn through process, right? So, I mean, it's like there are things that I've learned through that I probably would have never learned otherwise. But I would say that from a standpoint of safety and being sure that I had the patient's best interest, there wasn't any harm. There wasn't any violations of the patient's right as a patient. They weren't forced or coerced into doing these therapies. They self-elected the therapy. So, my opinion is the state actually came in and they actually came with an excessive position that they really had no right to come into. I mean, to investigate is one thing, but to actually, put me on the chopping block was quite the other. And the other thing that actually came into the process was that the same cancer institute that actually reported me was then starting to advertise that they were doing personalized type treatments, which they were not. And it was kind of just an interesting, not a coincidence, I believe. I think it was very much planned. And the thing is that it was just blown out of proportion. There were many closed door meetings where there were things said behind closed doors. Like, for instance, I was accused of being like a Joseph Mengele for doing experimental treatments on patients when patients were actually living and they didn't have any hope for their cancer at all. And like I said, you actually heard yourself from patients, a patient with multiple myeloma that's still alive today, which is over 15 or 16 years since her original diagnosis. And I was practicing already for over 20 years. So it wasn't something, I wasn't a new doctor that just came out into the cancer practice. I was actually already in practice for 20 years with experience in working with end stage cancer and chronic illness. So the thing is that the things that I've learned is that, what I've destroyed the treatments based upon that order, I would go back and say, no, I would not destroy the treatments. What I've administered them and have been less fearful, yes, and most likely now today with what I know, I would administer those treatments to the patients, and I would continue to do what I was doing because I knew what I was doing was the right thing to do for the patients. And of course, since then, we have the right to try that has been passed on a federal level. Of course, at that time, right to try was fairly new. Only a few states were actually being exposed to it. And now patients actually have greater rights to choose an experimental form of treatment than they did, 5 years ago. I mean, so the thing is that we've got a lot of, I would say, good things that have happened since then, including which, now with my current founding of my current company, we're doing in a greater measure where we're actually helping greater number of patients because of the fact that we've actually taking this technology and it's the technology to help patients with resistant disease.
Okay, on that note, No Name asks, why do you keep on referring to his treatment as a vaccine? That was what everybody was saying. I even believe you may have referenced it that way back in 2014. But why were they calling it a vaccine? What can you explain that a little bit?
Well, they were calling it a vaccine because anything that is actually made from biological tissue or anything that is actually going to stimulate the immune system to induce a certain immune response or regulate against a certain response would be classified as a biologic, and the biologic would be classified as a vaccine. That is actually how the FDA classifies it. Currently, we actually call it the same thing, and it's a personalized vaccine that is specifically derived for the patient, and only the patient can use this vaccine. So, like, in other words, we can't use one patient's vaccine on another patient's vaccine because it's actually a personalized treatment. And so it only could be developed and used on the specific patient with a specific diagnosis. And it was the same thing back then when we had the first generation. It was a vaccine specifically derived from the patient's tissue and administered to the patient. It wasn't foreign tissue, but it was still classified as a vaccine.
Okay. So I want to respond to this. So what way would this story change if the fine doctor is a quack, or would it? As a journalist, I feel like it's not my responsibility to tell the public, like, you are a quack. It's, in this particular case, the failing on my part was that we never got a statement from you at all, And so, like, right. I would have gotten information from you. What exactly were you doing? What were you up to? Is this a vaccine? What's the Department of Health saying? What's happening behind the scenes? Ask more questions. And then, what? Here you go, public. Joe Q public. What do you think about Dr. John Cotenzero after this? And that was the failure on my part. I should have pushed back with my managers and said, this isn't fair. This isn't fair that we're just going to run this without hearing from him. Again, not our responsibility to run interference for you, not our responsibility to run public relations for you, but it is our responsibility to be fair. And we were very unfair. And I think, there are, endless examples of exactly that kind of thing happening on a regular basis, which is why I wanted to bring you on the channel, because we are at that point in time where, the stakes are even higher with this pandemic. And, I think mainstream journalists are perpetuating some of the same issues that I've talked about here. And there are very valuable doctors that are facing similar consequences for some of the same reasons.
Right.
Yes. The groupthink, the speed, whatever it is. And so, it's not like I'm trying to bring up dirty laundry or anything from the past. Is to say, to the public, listen, even the most well-meaning journalists can do this. We're all capable of it. That's why I always try to remember, I'm capable of the thing that I might look at my adversary and I might want to believe I would never do that. But the second you do that, it's now you're really susceptible to doing it, because now you're not on alert that you're capable of the same human failings as any other person. But for the journalists who watch my channel, be aware that this is not okay. It's not okay for us to not get a statement from someone and, you know, because we just like, oh, their office is closed, sorry, at 6 p.m. and we just got to fill the newscast because that's all we care about. You know, we got to fill the newscast. And I can't tell you how many times I've been ripped off stories and just like in their stories, like this is the total opposite. It's like important stories that I had people completely rearrange their schedules, you know, screw up their day, sit down with me for an hour. And then my boss go, oh, you know, this dumb, stupid, like prank just happened, but it has good video. So just leave. I'll never forget. It was actually a mother she was a widow. Her son had been killed in Iraq. And it was also her birthday and the anniversary of her son's death. I'll never forget this. And I'm like the only one there with her that day on this very terrible day of hers. And I sit down to do this interview and my phone rings and they're like, we got to move you. And I'm like, no, you know, and I remember fighting back. I was like, I'm going to finish this. We don't necessarily have to air it today, but I'm going to finish this interview. I'm not going to just leave this lady hanging. Like we don't even care about her story, but that's all it is. You know, get to the stuff that matters to us, get to the stuff that we need to have that our competitors have, make sure that we're not, you know, behind on our deadlines and, you know, the truth be damned, it has to be on at 11. And if we don't have all the information, sorry, because we're going to be fine. Tomorrow, we're going to be okay, but you're going to have to suffer the consequences of our behavior.
Right. Yeah. I think that one of the things that actually came as well was the snowball effect of other stories being built upon the main story that were actually not even related to the original story. So it was like there were, you know, factors about Mars Hill Church and this and that. Pastors families and and the pastors coming to see us as physicians. I mean, it was a total violation of HIPAA. I mean, and it wasn't coming from you, but it was coming from other news people piggybacking stories that were totally unrelated and untrue to try to sensationalize the whole process, which was actually ridiculous, you know? So.